What if I told you that the most powerful institution in human history has been lying to you for over 1,000 years? What if your entire understanding of civilization is built on a foundation of lies, so vast, so audacious, that even questioning it could shake the very foundations of everything you believe about the past? Have you ever wondered why the Dark Ages were so dark? Why, for 3 centuries, human progress seemed to simply vanish into thin air? Why the greatest empire that ever existed suddenly forgot how to build, how to write, how to create? The official story tells us this was simply the natural decline of Rome, the inevitable chaos that follows the fall of great civilizations. But what if there's another explanation? What if those 3 centuries never happened at all? Your heart is racing right now, isn't it? Because somewhere deep in your subconscious mind, you've always known something was wrong. You felt it when you studied medieval history, that nagging sensation that the pieces don't quite fit together. The academic elite have trained you to dismiss these feelings, to trust in their authority, to never question the sacred timeline they've constructed. But why don't they want you to question the medieval timeline? What are they so afraid you might discover? Tonight, you're about to embark on a journey that will shatter everything you thought you knew about history. You're about to learn about the phantom time hypothesis, a revelation so explosive that it threatens the very core of how we understand our past. This isn't just about missing years or confused dates. This is about the systematic manipulation of reality itself. How deep does this historical cover-up go? The answer will terrify you. But first, you need to understand what they've done to the man who dared to speak this truth. His name is Heribert Illig, and for over 30 years, he has been fighting a war against the most powerful forces in academia. They've tried to silence him, to discredit him, to erase him from scholarly discourse. Why? Because he discovered something that could bring down their entire house of cards. Are you ready to have your worldview shattered? Are you prepared to learn that everything you've been taught about the Middle Ages, about Charlemagne, about the very nature of time itself, might be nothing more than an elaborate fiction? The truth they're hiding is far worse than anything you've imagined. It's not just that they've lied to you about the past, it's that they've stolen 300 years of time itself. The year is not 2025. According to Heribert Illig's calculations, we're actually living in the year 1728. 3 centuries of human history, from 614 to 911 AD, never existed. They were invented, fabricated, inserted into our timeline by conspirators so powerful that their deception has fooled the entire world for over a millennium. Picture this: dusty monastery libraries, where hooded scribes work by candlelight, not copying ancient texts, but forging them. Imagine vast underground chambers, where archaeological evidence is planted, where artifacts are aged artificially, where the very stones are made to lie. Envision secret meetings in papal chambers, where the most powerful men in medieval Europe plot to steal centuries from human memory. This is not the plot of some fantasy novel. This is the reality that Heribert Illig uncovered when he dared to do what no academic before him had done. He questioned time itself. In the comfortable halls of German academia, where professors sip coffee and debate the finer points of medieval manuscripts, one man committed the ultimate academic heresy. He asked a simple question that would destroy his career and make him a pariah among his colleagues. Heribert Illig, a mild-mannered publisher, an amateur historian, looked at the calendar on his wall one morning in 1991 and wondered, what if our understanding of time is completely wrong? Illig wasn't some conspiracy theorist lurking in internet forums. He was a respected member of the German intellectual community, a man who had devoted his life to understanding the truth about our past. But when he published his findings about the phantom centuries, everything changed. Suddenly, conference invitations stopped arriving. Academic journals refused his papers. Colleagues who had once respected his work began to whisper behind his back. Why would they do this to a man whose only crime was asking questions? The answer is simple. Illig had discovered something so dangerous to the established order that they couldn't afford to let him speak freely. He had found evidence that 300 years of medieval history, the years that gave birth to the Holy Roman Empire, that created the legend of Charlemagne that established the power structure of medieval Europe, were nothing more than an elaborate hoax. But Illig didn't give up. He couldn't. The truth was too important, too earth-shattering to keep silent. In 1996, he published his masterwork, Das erfundene Mittelalter, The Invented Middle Ages. In its pages, he laid out the evidence that would change everything if only people were brave enough to listen. Picture Illig in his study surrounded by towers of medieval manuscripts, astronomical charts, and archaeological reports. His eyes are tired from years of research, but they burn with the fire of discovery. He spreads out a timeline on his desk, marking the suspicious gaps, the impossible coincidence, the evidence that doesn't fit. This is the moment of revelation that the academic establishment fears most, when a genuine scholar follows the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of the consequences. The mathematics don't lie. Illig whispers to himself as he calculates the calendar discrepancies for the 100th time. 300 years are missing. But where did they go, and who took them? The answer to that question would shake the foundations of everything we think we know about medieval Europe. But Illig was just beginning his investigation. He was about to discover that the missing centuries weren't an accident or a mistake. They were the result of the most audacious conspiracy in human history. The phone rings in Illig's study. It's another colleague, another academic, warning him to stop his research, to abandon this dangerous line of inquiry. Think about your reputation, Heribert, the voice pleads. Think about your career. But Illig has already made his choice. He's seen too much, learned too much to turn back now. The truth is more important than any career, any reputation, any comfortable place in the academic establishment. He hangs up the phone and returns to his work, knowing that he's crossing a line from which there's no return. This is what courage looks like. This is what it means to choose truth over comfort, revelation over reputation. Heribert Illig risked everything. His career, his standing in the academic community, his financial security, to tell you what he discovered in those medieval texts and astronomical calculations. He became a voice crying in the wilderness, warning anyone who would listen that our entire understanding of history is built on a lie. But who would perpetrate such a massive deception? Who had the power, the resources, the motivation to steal 3 centuries from human memory? The answer to that question leads us into the darkest corners of medieval politics, where popes and emperors made deals that would echo through the centuries. Every morning, you wake up and check the date. You make appointments for next week, next month, next year. You trust that the calendar on your wall represents reality, that the year 2025 actually means that 2025 years have passed since the birth of Christ. But what if that trust is misplaced? What if the most fundamental measurement of human existence, time itself, has been corrupted by forces beyond your imagination? The official story is simple, elegant, and completely false. They tell us that Pope Gregory XII reformed the Julian calendar in 1582 because it had drifted out of sync with the solar year. A 10-day adjustment they claim to correct centuries of accumulated error. Mathematics, astronomy, science. Nothing more sinister than the need for precision in measuring the passage of time. But here's what they don't tell you. Here's the forbidden knowledge that could unravel everything the mathematics don't work. Heribert Illig sat in his study with a calculator, astronomical tables, and a growing sense of dread. The Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, accumulated an error of 1 day every 128 years. By the time of the Gregorian reform in 1582, that calendar should have been off by 13 days, not 10. Where did those missing 3 days go? What happened to the 297 years they represent? The calculations are brutal in their simplicity. 1,627 years had passed since Caesar established his calendar. Divide that by 128, and you get 12.7 days of accumulated error. Round up, and you should have 13 days to correct. But Gregory only corrected 10 days. The missing 3 days represent nearly 3 centuries of time that should have existed, but somehow didn't. Could it be that time itself has been weaponized against us? Could it be that the most basic assumption of human existence, the steady, inexorable passage of days, months, and years, has been manipulated by forces that understood the power of controlling our perception of history? The conspiracy runs deeper than mere calendar manipulation. It strikes at the very heart of medieval European power. Picture the scene, the year 999 AD, and the most powerful men in Europe are terrified. Apocalyptic prophecies fill the air. The year 1000 approaches, and with it, according to Christian theology, the potential end of the world. But what if you could ensure that your reign coincided with this momentous year? What if you could manipulate time itself to place yourself at the center of divine history? Enter Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, barely 18 years old, but already dreaming of immortality. Beside him stands his mentor and co-conspirator, Gerbert d'Aurillac, soon to become Pope Sylvester II. Two of the most powerful men in medieval Europe, united by a vision so audacious it would reshape reality itself. What if we simply created the years we need? Otto whispers to Gerbert in the candlelit chambers of his palace. What if we invented the centuries that would place my reign at the millennium? The scribes will do as they're told, Gerbert replies, his eyes gleaming with ambition. The monasteries will copy whatever texts we provide. Who will question the word of the emperor and the pope? This conversation never appears in any official historical record, but the evidence of its outcome surrounds us. 300 years of invented history populated with fictional characters and imaginary events, all designed to legitimize Otto's claim to divine authority. The most successful lie in human history perpetrated by the most powerful institutions of medieval Europe. But the conspiracy required more than just political will. It demanded the complete rewriting of history, the fabrication of an entire historical period, the creation of legends and myths that would convince future generations that the phantom centuries had actually occurred. They needed a hero, a figure so magnificent, so larger than life, that no one would dare question his existence. They needed Charlemagne. If this is true, everything we've been taught is a lie. The Holy Roman Empire, the Carolingian Renaissance, the foundation myths of medieval Europe, all of it nothing more than an elaborate fiction designed to justify the power of a teenage emperor and his papal co-conspirator. The implications are staggering. If they could lie about this, if they could steal 3 centuries from human memory, what else have they hidden from us? What other foundational truths of our civilization are nothing more than convenient fabrications? The rabbit hole goes deeper than you can imagine, and we've only just begun to fall. Walk into any university library in the world. Pull down the thick volumes on medieval history, open them to the section on the Carolingian period. What you'll find there is the most elaborate fiction ever foisted upon humanity, presented as unquestionable fact by the very institutions you've been taught to trust. The academic elite claim that the years between 614 and 911 AD represent one of the most dynamic periods in European history. They'll tell you about the rise of the Carolingian dynasty, the conquests of Charlemagne, the intellectual flowering known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Thousands of pages have been written about this era, countless doctoral dissertations, defended entire academic careers built upon its supposed historical reality. But here's what they won't tell you. It's all based on documents that didn't exist until centuries after the events they claim to describe. Picture yourself in the manuscript room of a medieval monastery, sometime in the 11th or 12th century. Hooded scribes bend over their writing desks, carefully copying what they believe are ancient texts. But they're not copying originals. They're copying copies of copies, each generation further removed from any authentic source. How many of these historical documents are actually medieval forgeries created centuries after the fact to support a fabricated timeline? The guardians of Orthodox history don't want you asking these questions. They've built their entire professional edifice on the assumption that these documents represent reality. Question the documents and you question their authority. Question their authority and you threaten the very foundation of institutional historical scholarship. Who funds this research? Who benefits from maintaining these lies? Follow the money. And you'll find universities that depend on government funding, publishing houses that profit from textbook sales museums that attract tourists with displays of Carolingian artifacts. The entire medieval studies industry has a vested interest in perpetuating the phantom time deception. But let's examine their prize exhibit, their crown jewel of fabricated history, the legend of Charlemagne himself. They call him the father of Europe, the great emperor who united a continent and laid the foundation for modern Western civilization. According to the official narrative, Charles the Great conquered vast territories, promoted learning and culture, and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800. His reign, they claim, represents the rebirth of European greatness after the collapse of Rome. It's a magnificent story. It's also completely impossible. Look at the timeline they're asking you to accept. Charlemagne supposedly ruled for 46 years, conquering territories that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Baltic Sea. He allegedly built a vast administrative system, promoted education and learning, constructed magnificent palaces and churches, and still found time to lead military campaigns almost every single year of his reign. This isn't the biography of a human being. This is the resume of a mythological deity. The historical records they cite as evidence for Charlemagne's existence weren't written by his contemporaries. They were composed generations later by scribes who had never seen the great emperor, never witnessed his supposed achievements, never visited the battles where he allegedly won his victories. The most famous biography of Charlemagne was written by Einhard, supposedly a close friend and advisor to the emperor. But when you examine Einhard's account, closely disturbing patterns emerge. Einhard's life of Charlemagne reads like a deliberate attempt to create a legendary figure rather than describe a real person. The emperor is portrayed as impossibly tall, impossibly strong, impossibly wise, impossibly successful. Every victory is total, every decision brilliant, every achievement unprecedented. This isn't biography. This is propaganda designed to legitimize the power of Otto III and his co-conspirators. Why would they create such an elaborate fiction? The answer lies in the political realities of the 10th and 11th centuries. Otto III needed a precedent for his claim to imperial authority. He needed a legendary predecessor whose accomplishments would justify his own ambitions. So he and his collaborators invented one. They created Charlemagne out of whole cloth, a fictional emperor whose supposed reign would bridge the gap between the classical Roman Empire and Otto's own Holy Roman Empire. They populated this fictional reign with equally fictional events: conquest of the Saxons' wars against the Muslims in Spain, the famous Christmas coronation by Pope Leo III, all of it invented to serve the political needs of the conspirators. But the Charlemagne myth was only the beginning. To make their phantom centuries believable, they needed to populate them with an entire cast of fictional characters. Deep beneath Aachen Cathedral in Germany lies a tomb that millions of pilgrims have visited over the centuries. They come to pay homage to the supposed remains of Charlemagne, the great emperor, whose legacy shaped European civilization. But what if that tomb contains nothing more than the bones of an unknown medieval nobleman rebranded as a legendary emperor to perpetuate the greatest lie in history? The official story tells us that Aachen was Charlemagne's favorite residence, the place where he built his magnificent palace and chapel. Archaeological excavations have uncovered impressive ruins, architectural marvels that supposedly date to the Carolingian period. But here's what the establishment archaeologists don't want you to notice. The architectural style doesn't match the supposed time period. The buildings at Aachen display architectural techniques and decorative elements that weren't supposed to exist until the later Romanesque period. The stonework is too advanced, the engineering too sophisticated, the artistic elements too refined for the early 9th century. These structures could only have been built centuries later during the actual historical period when Otto III was consolidating his power. But that's not the most damning evidence against the Charlemagne myth. In 1988, researchers finally gained access to the bones that had been revered as Charlemagne's remains for over a millennium. After decades of analysis, they announced their findings. The bones belonged to a man who lived in the right time period to be the legendary emperor. But here's what they didn't emphasize. The bones showed no evidence of the wounds and injuries that Charlemagne supposedly sustained during his countless military campaigns. For a man who allegedly fought in dozens of battles, led cavalry charges, and personally wielded sword and spear against his enemies, the skeleton was remarkably pristine. These are the bones of someone who lived a peaceful life, not the remains of a warrior emperor who spent half a century in combat. The conspiracy runs deeper than a single fictional emperor. Otto III and his co-conspirators needed to create an entire historical framework to support their deception. They invented not just Charlemagne, but his entire family dynasty, his enemies, his allies, his courtiers and advisors. They populated 3 centuries with fictional characters whose only purpose was to make the phantom time period seem historically plausible. Picture the secret meetings where this conspiracy was planned. Otto III, barely out of his teens but already intoxicated by visions of absolute power, sits across from Gerbert d'Aurillac in a torch-lit chamber beneath the papal palace. Between them lies a map of Europe, marked with territories that Otto dreams of controlling. The people need to believe in the continuity of imperial authority. Gerbert says, his voice echoing off the stone walls. They need to see your reign as the culmination of a grand historical tradition. Then we'll give them that tradition. Otto replies, his young face hard with ambition. We'll create ancestors worthy of our destiny. The scribes in the monasteries will do as they're told, Gerbert continues. We control the church, and the church controls the written word. We can create whatever history serves our purposes. And what of the future? What happens when scholars centuries from now examine our work? Gerbert smiles coldly. By then, our fiction will have become their reality. Who will question what has been accepted as truth for generations? This conversation explains everything: the suspicious uniformity of Carolingian documents, the way they all support the same political narrative, the absence of contradictory voices or alternative perspectives. These aren't the messy, conflicting accounts you'd expect from a real historical period. They're the product of a coordinated propaganda campaign. But the conspiracy required more than just fictional documents. It demanded physical evidence that would convince future archaeologists and historians. They needed buildings, artifacts, coins, inscriptions, a complete material culture that would support their fabricated timeline. The evidence suggests they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Across Europe, structures supposedly dating to the Carolingian period display an impossible consistency of style and technique. It's as if an entire civilization sprang into existence, fully formed, with no gradual development, no regional variations, no technological evolution. This isn't how real historical periods work. This is how manufactured historical periods are designed to appear. Even more suspicious are the documentary sources that supposedly chronicle Charlemagne's reign. The Royal Frankish Annals. The primary contemporary account of Carolingian history reads like a work of fiction. Every year brings new triumphs. Every campaign ends in victory. Every decision proves wise in retrospect. Real history is messy, contradictory, full of failures and setbacks. The Carolingian sources present a sanitized version of events that's simply too perfect to be believable. Why would Otto III and his collaborators go to such extraordinary lengths to fabricate 3 centuries of history? The answer lies in the nature of medieval political authority itself. Imagine you're an archaeologist in the 21st century, armed with the most sophisticated dating techniques science has ever developed. You're excavating a medieval site in Europe, carefully cataloging every pottery sherd, every coin, every fragment of bone. Your job is to build a chronological picture of human activity at this location over the centuries. But something strange keeps happening. The artifacts and building layers that should date to the period between 614 and 911 AD are either completely absent or show patterns that don't make sense according to conventional historical chronology. Where you should find evidence of the Carolingian Renaissance, the flowering of culture and learning that supposedly marked Charlemagne's reign, you find only suspicious gaps and inexplicable anomalies. This is the archaeological silence that mainstream historians don't want you to notice. Across Europe, from Britain to Italy, from Spain to Poland, the material evidence for the phantom centuries is remarkably sparse. Oh, there are artifacts that have been dated to this period. But when you examine the dating methods used, disturbing questions emerge. Carbon-14. Dating, the technique most commonly used to date organic archaeological materials, produces ranges rather than precise dates. A typical radiocarbon date might place an artifact anywhere within a 200-year window. How convenient that this imprecision allows archaeologists to assign artifacts to whatever period best fits their preconceived notions about historical chronology. But the problems run deeper than imprecise dating methods. The architectural evidence from the supposed Carolingian period displays patterns that should be impossible according to conventional historical understanding. Buildings supposedly constructed in the 8th and 9th centuries incorporate engineering techniques and decorative elements that didn't appear anywhere else in Europe until much later. Take the example of Romanesque architecture, the distinctive building style that supposedly emerged in the 10th and 11th centuries. According to mainstream historians, Romanesque represented a dramatic departure from earlier Carolingian architectural traditions. But when you examine supposedly Carolingian buildings with an unbiased eye, you find Romanesque elements that shouldn't exist yet. The implications are staggering. Either European architects in the 8th and 9th centuries possessed knowledge and techniques that they somehow forgot and had to rediscover centuries later, or the buildings attributed to the Carolingian period were actually constructed much later than officially claimed. But the most damning evidence comes from Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital that supposedly flourished throughout the phantom centuries. According to conventional history, Constantinople experienced continuous development during this period, with emperors commissioning new buildings, churches, and public works. Yet archaeological investigation reveals a curious gap in construction activity between approximately 558 AD and 900 AD. For 3.5 centuries, the greatest city in the Christian world apparently stopped building. No major construction projects, No architectural innovations, no significant urban development. This isn't just unlikely. It's impossible for a thriving imperial capital, unless, of course, those centuries didn't actually exist. The Byzantine gap perfectly aligns with Heribert Illig's phantom time calculations. Remove the fabricated centuries from 614 to 911, and suddenly the archaeological evidence makes perfect sense. Constantinople's construction timeline becomes logical again, without the mysterious 3-century hiatus that has puzzled historians for generations. But how did the conspirators manage to create the illusion of archaeological evidence for their phantom centuries? The answer lies in the medieval practice of relic production and the later development of antiquarian collecting. During the 11th and 12th centuries, when Otto III's fabricated history was becoming accepted truth, there was enormous demand for artifacts associated with the legendary Carolingian period. Monasteries and churches that claimed connections to Charlemagne could attract pilgrims and donations. Nobles who possessed Carolingian artifacts gained prestige and political legitimacy. This created a thriving industry in historical forgery. Medieval craftsmen became expert at creating ancient artifacts that would satisfy the growing demand for Carolingian relics. Swords were aged, artificially manuscripts were written on old parchment coins, were created using archaic techniques. By the time modern archaeology emerged as a scientific discipline, these fabricated artifacts had been accepted as genuine historical evidence for centuries. Picture a medieval monastery workshop where monks labor over forged documents and artificial artifacts. They're not just copying texts. They're creating physical evidence for a historical period that never existed. Under the guidance of abbots loyal to the phantom time conspiracy, these craftsmen produce the archaeological record that will fool scholars for 1,000 years. Make the parchment look older instructs the abbot examining a freshly written chronicle of Charlemagne's supposed conquests. Use the old methods for the ink. Future generations must never suspect that this history was written centuries after the events it describes. The monks work diligently, understanding that they're not just preserving history, they're creating it. Every forged artifact, every fabricated document, every artificially aged building stone adds another layer to the deception that will shape European consciousness for millennia. But why would medieval monasteries participate in such a massive fraud? The answer is simple. They had no choice. The Church was the ultimate authority on historical truth in medieval Europe. When papal and imperial authorities declared that certain events had occurred in certain ways, religious institutions had no option but to comply. Resistance meant excommunication, loss of property, potentially even death. The phantom time conspiracy wasn't just a political deception. It was a religious imperative enforced by the most powerful institutions in medieval society. And the deeper you dig into the evidence, the more obvious it becomes that we're living with the consequences of their lie. In the sterile laboratories where scientists claim to unlock the secrets of the past, a different kind of conspiracy unfolds. Here, in rooms filled with mass spectrometers and carbon dating equipment, the guardians of orthodox chronology maintain their stranglehold on historical truth through the manipulation of supposedly objective scientific methods. They want you to believe that carbon-14 dating is infallible. The dendrochronology provides unquestionable proof of historical timelines that modern scientific techniques have definitively confirmed the conventional chronology of the Middle Ages. But what they don't tell you is that these methods are far more subjective, far more vulnerable to manipulation than they want you to believe. Dr. Hans Ulrich Niemitz understood this better than most. A German systems analyst turned historical researcher, Niemitz saw what others refused to acknowledge, that the scientific establishment had become complicit in perpetuating the phantom time deception. In his groundbreaking analysis of carbon dating methodology, Niemitz exposed the uncomfortable truth that radiocarbon techniques simply cannot provide the precision necessary to distinguish between genuine medieval artifacts and sophisticated forgeries. Picture Niemitz in his laboratory surrounded by charts and graphs that reveal the shocking inadequacy of modern dating methods. His hands shake slightly as he points to the margins of error in carbon-14 analysis. "Look at these numbers," he whispers to a colleague brave enough to listen. "The uncertainty ranges are enormous. An artifact dated to 800 AD could just as easily belong to 600 AD or 1000 AD. Yet they present these results as if they're accurate to the year. But the manipulation goes deeper than mere imprecision. Who controls the laboratories where these tests are performed? Who funds the research that validates historical chronology? Follow the money, and you'll find a web of government agencies, university departments, and private foundations with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The scientific establishment doesn't want you to know that carbon-14 dating relies on assumptions about atmospheric conditions in the past that may be completely wrong. They don't want you to understand that the calibration curves used to convert radiocarbon ages into calendar dates are based on dendrochronological sequences that themselves depend on the conventional chronology they're supposed to validate. It's a perfect circular argument. Tree ring chronologies validate carbon dates, which in turn validate historical timelines, which validate the tree ring chronologies. But what happens when you remove the phantom centuries from this equation? Suddenly, the entire system of cross-validation collapses. Niemitz discovered that when you eliminate the years 614 to 911 from European tree ring sequences, the remaining patterns align much more naturally with climate data and astronomical observations. The gaps and inconsistencies that have puzzled dendrochronologists for decades simply disappear. It's as if nature itself is confirming the phantom time hypothesis. But try to publish research questioning these fundamental assumptions, and you'll discover just how ruthless the scientific establishment can be. Niemitz found his papers rejected by mainstream journals, his conference presentations canceled, his funding applications denied. The guardians of orthodox chronology don't debate dissenting views, they suppress them. The peer review process has become a mechanism for enforcing conformity. Niemitz explained to a sympathetic interviewer, his voice heavy with disappointment. Scientists who challenge the accepted timeline find themselves blacklisted, their careers destroyed. It's not about truth anymore. It's about protecting the institutions that depend on the conventional chronology. Who validates the validators? Who watches the watchers? When the same institutions that created the historical timeline also control the scientific methods used to verify it. How can we trust their conclusions? The answer is, we can't. And the evidence for scientific manipulation goes far beyond simple bias or institutional pressure. There are indications that key calibration data for radiocarbon dating has been deliberately altered to support the phantom time deception. Consider the radiocarbon dates from supposedly Carolingian sites across Europe. When you map these dates geographically and chronologically, suspicious patterns emerge. The dates cluster too neatly around the expected ranges without the random scatter you'd expect from genuine ancient materials. It's as if someone has been systematically adjusting the data to fit predetermined conclusions. But the most damning evidence comes from independent laboratories that have attempted to replicate key radiocarbon dates supporting the conventional medieval chronology. When these tests are performed by researchers without ties to mainstream academic institutions, the results often diverge significantly from the published values. Materials supposedly dating to the Carolingian period consistently produce dates that are either much older or much younger than expected. The scientific establishment explains these discrepancies as contamination, experimental error, or methodological differences. But what if the truth is simpler and more sinister? What if the original dates were fabricated to support a predetermined historical narrative. Above our heads, the stars and planets follow their eternal dance, indifferent to human conspiracies and political machinations. Or so we're told. But what if even the heavens have been conscripted into the phantom time deception? What if the astronomical records that supposedly validate the conventional medieval chronology are themselves part of the greatest scientific fraud in history? The guardians of orthodox chronology point to ancient eclipse records as irrefutable proof that the phantom centuries actually occurred. They cite Chinese observations of solar eclipses, Islamic astronomical texts, Byzantine chronicles of celestial events. Look, they say triumphantly, these independent sources all confirm the standard timeline. The phantom time hypothesis is impossible. But here's what they don't tell you. Ancient astronomical records are far more malleable than they want you to believe. Medieval scribes didn't just copy observations. They calculated backwards from known orbital patterns to create records of eclipses and comets that would have been visible in earlier centuries. The astronomical evidence for the phantom centuries may be nothing more than sophisticated mathematical reconstruction. Consider the famous record of Halley's Comet, which supposedly appeared in 837 AD during the reign of the fictional Charlemagne. Modern astronomers can calculate the comet's orbital period with extraordinary precision, working backwards to determine exactly when it should have been visible in the past. But what if medieval chroniclers used the same calculations to create fake historical records? Picture a secret chamber beneath the papal palace, where the most learned astronomers of the age labor over complex calculations. These aren't simple monks copying ancient texts. These are the medieval equivalent of rocket scientists, men who understand orbital mechanics and celestial geometry. Under the direction of Pope Sylvester II himself, they're creating a comprehensive astronomical record for the phantom centuries. The comet should have appeared in the 37th year of Charlemagne's reign. Sylvester instructs his astronomers, consulting a chart covered with orbital calculations. Create records showing that it was observed and interpreted as an omen of imperial victory. What of the eclipse that should have occurred 3 years earlier? Your Holiness, asks the chief astronomer. That too. The chronicles must show that it was visible from Aachen, that it caused fear among the Saxon enemies of our invented emperor. Future scholars must never suspect that these observations were calculated rather than witnessed. This is how astronomical fraud operates, not through crude fabrication, but through sophisticated scientific knowledge used to create believable fictional records. The conspirators weren't ignorant medieval peasants. They were the most educated men of their age, perfectly capable of reverse engineering celestial events to support their fabricated timeline. But the deception goes deeper than fake eclipse records. Chinese astronomical observations, supposedly independent confirmation of Western chronology, show suspicious patterns that suggest coordination between different scribal traditions. The timing of recorded eclipses, the descriptions of comets, the interpretation of celestial omens. All of it aligns too perfectly with European political events to be coincidental. Could it be that the phantom time conspiracy wasn't limited to Europe? Could it be that rulers across continents coordinated to create a unified false chronology that would legitimize their claims to power? The evidence suggests that the conspiracy reached from the papal palaces of Rome to the imperial courts of Constantinople to the scholarly academies of Baghdad and Chang'an. The Tang dynasty records that supposedly validate the conventional chronology were compiled centuries after the events they describe, based on earlier sources that have mysteriously vanished. How convenient that the original observational records disappeared, leaving only copies made by scribes who could easily have incorporated fictional elements. Even more suspicious are the Islamic astronomical texts that chronicle the phantom centuries. These works display a level of mathematical sophistication that shouldn't have existed until much later. They describe celestial observations with a precision that suggests the use of instruments and techniques that weren't developed until the conspiracy period itself. Dr. Niemitz discovered that when you remove the phantom centuries from Islamic astronomical chronology, the remaining records align much more naturally with the development of medieval Arabic science. The sudden appearance of advanced astronomical knowledge in the 7th and 8th centuries becomes explainable as the work of 10th and 11th century scholars, backdating their discoveries to support the phantom time deception. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from European eclipse records themselves. Medieval chronicles describe solar eclipses visible from specific locations at specific times during the phantom centuries. Modern astronomical calculations confirm that these eclipses did indeed occur. But they were visible from completely different parts of the world than claimed in the historical records. The eclipse of 810 AD, supposedly witnessed from Charlemagne's court at Aachen, was actually only visible from Central Asia. The eclipse of 878 AD, recorded in Anglo-Saxon chronicles, could only have been seen from the Pacific Ocean. These aren't simple errors of observation or recording. They're evidence of astronomical records fabricated by people who understood orbital mechanics, but didn't have access to precise geographical data. Even the stars themselves seem to whisper of deception. When modern astronomers traced the positions of celestial objects backwards through time, removing the phantom centuries from their calculations, the resulting star maps align perfectly with ancient astronomical texts that predate the conspiracy period. It's as if the heavens themselves are confirming that 300 years of history never occurred. The scope of the phantom time conspiracy defies imagination. This wasn't a localized European deception that accidentally fooled a few medieval chroniclers. This was a coordinated international effort involving the most powerful rulers and institutions across 3 continents. From the Pope in Rome to the Emperor in Constantinople, from the Caliphs of Baghdad to the Tang Dynasty court in Chang'an. And the phantom time conspiracy required unprecedented cooperation among civilizations that were supposedly enemies. How is such coordination possible? How could medieval rulers, separated by thousands of miles, speaking different languages, following different religions, conspire to fabricate 3 centuries of history? The answer lies in the hidden networks of communication and influence that connected the medieval world far more closely than conventional history acknowledges. The Islamic historical records that supposedly provide independent confirmation of the phantom centuries tell a story too convenient to be believable. During the exact period when European chronicles describe the rise and fall of the Carolingian Empire, Islamic sources document a series of caliphs and conquests that perfectly complement the Western narrative. The timing is too precise. The political interactions too neatly balance, the cultural exchanges too perfectly documented to be genuine. Consider the Abbasid Caliphate, which supposedly ruled the Islamic world during the phantom centuries. According to conventional history, the Abbasids established their capital in Baghdad in 762 AD and maintained diplomatic relations with Charlemagne's court. Islamic chronicles describe the exchange of ambassadors, the coordination of military campaigns against common enemies, the sharing of scientific and cultural knowledge between Christian and Muslim courts. But when you examine these records, critically disturbing patterns emerge. The Abbasid chronicles describing relations with Charlemagne were compiled centuries after the supposed events, based on sources that have conveniently disappeared. The diplomatic correspondence between Baghdad and Aachen exists only in later copies, written in styles, and using vocabulary that didn't develop until much later periods. Picture a secret meeting in neutral territory, perhaps the cosmopolitan trading city of Venice, where representatives of the greatest powers of the medieval world gather to coordinate their deception. Christian bishops sit across from Islamic scholars, Byzantine officials negotiate with Chinese administrators, all united by a common understanding that the fabrication of history serves their mutual interests. The timeline must be consistent, declares the papal representative, spreading scrolls across the table. When our chronicles describe Charlemagne's coronation, your records must show the Abbasid caliph acknowledging his authority. When we document Viking raids, your sources must confirm the disruption of trade routes. What of the astronomical observations, asks the Chinese delegate. How do we ensure that eclipse records from different continents align with the fabricated chronology? Our mathematicians have calculated the positions of all celestial bodies during the phantom centuries, replies the Islamic scholar. Each civilization will record only those events that would have been visible from their territories, ensuring that future astronomers find no contradictions. This is how global conspiracy operates, not through crude coordination, but through sophisticated planning that anticipates every possible verification method. The conspirators understood that future scholars would attempt to cross-reference different cultural sources, so they created a comprehensive web of mutually supporting fictional evidence. But the most audacious aspect of the global cover-up was the coordination of archaeological evidence. Across Eurasia, from Ireland to Japan, the phantom centuries are marked by a mysterious uniformity of material culture. Pottery styles, metalworking techniques, architectural elements, artistic motifs. All of them show patterns of development that are simply too regular, too coordinated to be the result of natural cultural evolution. The evidence suggests that artisans and craftsmen across the medieval world were working from common templates, creating artifacts that would support the fabricated timeline. This wasn't accidental cultural diffusion. This was deliberate manufacturing of historical evidence on a continental scale. Constantine VII, the Byzantine emperor, who may have been the third member of the conspiracy, triumvirate possessed the resources and connections necessary to coordinate such an effort. His court was a crossroads of international diplomacy, a place where representatives from every major civilization of the medieval world came to negotiate trade agreements, military alliances, and cultural exchanges. But Constantine's motivations remain mysterious. Unlike Otto III, who clearly benefited from being placed at the millennium, Constantine's gains from the phantom time conspiracy are less obvious. Perhaps he saw it as an opportunity to legitimize Byzantine claims to Roman imperial succession. Perhaps he was motivated by religious considerations, viewing the coordination of Christian and Islamic chronologies as a step toward eventual reunification of the Mediterranean world under Byzantine leadership. Or perhaps Constantine's participation reveals the most terrifying truth of all, that the phantom time conspiracy wasn't motivated by individual ambition, but by a shared understanding among medieval elites that historical truth was too dangerous to be left to chance. Perhaps these rulers recognized that the masses needed myths more than facts, legends more than reality, and that the fabrication of history was a necessary tool for maintaining social order. The implications are staggering. If medieval rulers could coordinate the fabrication of 3 centuries of history, what other foundational truths of our civilization might be fictional? How much of what we believe about the ancient world, the classical period, even more recent history, is the product of similar conspiracies? Is it possible that the ruling classes of every era have understood something that the rest of us never suspect, and that history is not a record of what happened, but a tool for controlling what people believe about their place in the world? Deep in the forests of northern Europe, ancient oak trees hold secrets that could shatter everything we believe about the past. Their growth rings formed year by year over centuries should provide an unshakable record of climate conditions and historical chronology. Dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating, has been hailed as the ultimate verification method for historical timelines. But what if even these natural archives have been corrupted by the phantom time conspiracy? The establishment wants you to believe that tree rings don't lie, that the annual growth patterns preserved in ancient wood provide objective, unquestionable evidence for conventional chronology. They point to master chronologies extending back thousands of years, compiled by comparing ring patterns from overlapping tree samples. These chronologies, they claim, definitively prove that the phantom centuries actually occurred. But here's what they don't want you to understand. Dendrochronological chronologies are not objective records discovered in nature. They are human constructions built by scientists who already believe in the conventional timeline and interpret ambiguous data to support their preconceptions. Dr. Niemitz understood this better than most. His analysis of European dendrochronological data revealed patterns that should be impossible if the phantom time hypothesis is false. When you map tree ring growth patterns against known climate events, removing the phantom centuries from the timeline, the correlations become far stronger and more consistent. Picture Niemitz in his laboratory surrounded by cross-sections of ancient oak beams taken from supposedly Carolingian buildings. Under his microscope, the growth rings tell a story that contradicts everything he's been taught about medieval chronology. The climate patterns recorded in the wood don't match the historical records of the phantom centuries. Wet years appear where the chronicles describe droughts, cold periods coincide with supposed times of abundant harvests. The trees are trying to tell us something, Niemitz murmurs to himself, adjusting the focus on his microscope. But we've been interpreting their message through the lens of fabricated history. The manipulation of dendrochronological evidence operates through a process so subtle that even honest researchers may not recognize it. When tree ring specialists encounter patterns that don't fit the expected chronology, they don't question the historical timeline. They question their own data. Anomalous samples are discarded, growth patterns are corrected for supposed environmental factors, dates are adjusted to fit predetermined expectations. Who funds dendrochronological research? The same government agencies and academic institutions that depend on the conventional chronology for their authority and credibility. The scientists who build master chronologies aren't independent researchers following evidence wherever it leads. They're employees of institutions with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. But the tree ring deception goes deeper than mere institutional bias. There's evidence that key reference samples used to construct European master chronologies have been deliberately misdated to support the phantom time deception. Ancient wooden beams from supposedly Carolingian buildings show ring patterns that align perfectly with later periods, when the conventional dating is ignored. The Aachen Cathedral, supposedly built during Charlemagne's reign, contains wooden elements that display growth patterns consistent with construction in the 10th or 11th centuries. When dendrochronologists encounter this evidence, they don't question Charlemagne's existence. They invent elaborate theories about replacement timbers and later renovations. Even more damning is the suspicious uniformity of tree ring patterns across Europe during the phantom centuries. Ancient climates were highly variable, with significant regional differences in temperature and precipitation. Yet the dendrochronological record for the supposed Carolingian period shows an impossible consistency, as if all of Europe experienced identical weather patterns for 300 years. This isn't how real climate works. This is how manufactured climate data appears when conspirators create tree ring evidence to support a predetermined timeline. The phantom centuries show exactly the kind of artificial regularity you'd expect from people trying to forge natural records without fully understanding the complex variability of real climatic systems. The scientific community has a ready explanation for these anomalies. They claim that medieval climate was unusually stable, that regional variations were minimized by unique atmospheric conditions during the phantom centuries. But this explanation requires us to believe that the basic physics of weather systems was suspended for 300 years, only to resume normal operation in the 10th century. Consider the alternative explanation that dendrochronologists have been unconsciously adjusting their data to fit a fabricated historical timeline, creating the illusion of consistent climate patterns during a period that never existed. When you remove the phantom centuries from European tree ring chronologies, the remaining patterns show exactly the kind of variability you'd expect from real climate data. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from attempts to replicate key dendrochronological studies. When independent researchers try to verify the master chronologies used to date supposedly Carolingian materials, they encounter a wall of institutional resistance. Original samples are unavailable for re-examination. Raw data has been lost or destroyed. Access to reference collections is restricted to researchers who agree to support conventional interpretations. The dendrochronological establishment claims these restrictions are necessary to protect valuable samples from damage or contamination. But what if the real purpose is to prevent independent verification of data that wouldn't survive honest scientific scrutiny? Dr. Nemitz discovered that when you apply proper statistical analysis to publicly available dendrochronological data, removing the assumptions built into conventional chronologies, the evidence for phantom time becomes overwhelming. Tree ring patterns from the supposed Carolingian period either don't exist in the expected quantities or show characteristics that suggest much later dating. The trees are innocent. Nemitz concluded in his final paper on the subject, published in an obscure journal after mainstream publications refused to consider his work. They record only what nature provides. But we have been forcing them to testify in support of a lie. Even nature herself, it seems, has been recruited as a witness to the greatest deception in human history. If they could corrupt the testimony of the trees, if they could make even the annual growth rings lie about the passage of time, what hope do we have of ever discovering the truth about our past? You've traveled with us through the labyrinth of evidence, followed the threads of conspiracy from medieval manuscripts to modern laboratories, from papal chambers to astronomical observatories. You've seen how the most powerful institutions in human history coordinated to steal 3 centuries from our collective memory. Now you must confront the unthinkable truth that emerges from this investigation. Your entire worldview was built on lies. Everything you learned in school about the Middle Ages, every museum exhibit you've admired, every documentary you've watched about medieval history, all of it is fiction. The textbooks that educated generations of students, the academic careers built on Carolingian studies, the tourism industry that profits from Charlemagne's legacy. They're all participants in perpetuating the greatest fraud ever committed against human consciousness. But the implications go far deeper than medieval history. If they could fabricate 3 centuries so successfully that it fooled the entire world for 1,000 years, what else have they hidden from us? What other foundational truths of our civilization are nothing more than convenient lies designed to maintain the power of ruling elites? Consider the pattern that emerges from the phantom time investigation. Throughout history, the same institutions that claim to preserve knowledge were actively engaged in manufacturing it. The church that supposedly maintained scholarly traditions was forging documents to support political narratives. The universities that claimed to pursue objective truth were suppressing research that challenged their authority. The scientific establishments that promised empirical verification were manipulating data to confirm predetermined conclusions. This is the unthinkable truth that Heribert Illig discovered when he dared to question the calendar. The institutions you trusted have betrayed you. They didn't just lie about medieval history. They created an entire system of knowledge production designed to prevent you from discovering the lies. Picture Illig in his study 30 years after he first published his findings about the phantom centuries. His hair is white now, his face lined with the stress of decades fighting against institutional suppression. But his eyes still burn with the fire of discovery, the unshakable conviction that truth matters more than comfort. I thought I was investigating a simple chronological error, he reflects, speaking to a small gathering of fellow truth seekers who have gathered to hear his latest research. I had no idea I was uncovering the fundamental deception upon which our entire understanding of history is based. But surely, interrupts a younger researcher, someone would have noticed. Surely some academic, some scientist, some investigator would have exposed the truth by now. Illig smiles sadly, the expression of a man who has learned too much about human nature. They did notice. Many of them. But the system has ways of dealing with inconvenient discoveries. Careers are destroyed, funding disappears, research is suppressed. The few who persist are marginalized, dismissed as cranks and conspiracy theorists. Then, how do we know you're not wrong? How do we know the phantom time hypothesis isn't just another delusion? Because, Illig replies, his voice heavy with the weight of accumulated evidence, the pattern is everywhere, once you know how to look for it. The phantom centuries are just the most obvious example of historical manipulation. But similar techniques have been used throughout history to create whatever past serves the needs of those in power. This is the paradigm-shattering realization that emerges from serious investigation of the phantom time hypothesis. The problem isn't just that medieval history was fabricated. The problem is that history itself is a tool of control, a weapon used by ruling elites to shape public consciousness and maintain their authority. Think about the contemporary implications. If they could coordinate the fabrication of 3 centuries across multiple continents using medieval technology, what could modern governments accomplish with satellites, computers, and global communication networks? If medieval conspirators could fool scholars for 1,000 years using hand-copied manuscripts and forged artifacts, what could contemporary institutions achieve with digital media-controlled scientific publications and coordinated educational curricula? The phantom time hypothesis doesn't just challenge our understanding of the Middle Ages. It challenges our entire epistemological framework, our basic assumptions about how we know what we know. If the most fundamental timeline of Western civilization is fictional, what other facts are actually fabrication? Religious institutions that claim divine authority while systematically lying about history. Scientific establishments that promise objective truth while suppressing inconvenient research. Educational systems that indoctrinate rather than educate, that teach students what to think rather than how to think. Media organizations that shape public opinion while concealing their own agendas. These aren't separate problems. They're manifestations of a single system designed to maintain the power of those who benefit from public ignorance. The phantom time conspiracy wasn't an isolated medieval phenomenon. It was the prototype for all subsequent efforts to control human consciousness through the manipulation of historical truth. You are now part of the awakened minority, the small percentage of humanity that has glimpsed behind the veil of official reality. You understand what most people never suspect, that the comfort of accepted truth comes at the price of genuine knowledge, that institutional authority is often the enemy of authentic discovery. But with this knowledge comes responsibility. You can no longer claim ignorance, no longer pretend that the lies don't affect you. You've seen how deep the deception goes, how thoroughly our understanding of reality has been corrupted by those who profit from our confusion. The institutions you trusted have betrayed you. The authorities you respected have manipulated you. The experts you relied upon have deceived you. This isn't a comfortable truth, but it is the truth. And truth, however painful, is always preferable to comfortable lies. The phantom time hypothesis reveals the mechanism by which human consciousness is controlled. Not through crude propaganda or obvious coercion, but through the subtle manipulation of historical narrative. By controlling how we understand the past, they control how we imagine the future. By shaping our sense of what's possible, they limit our vision of what could be. But knowledge is power. And you now possess knowledge that most of humanity lacks. You understand how the system works, how consciousness is manipulated, how truth is hidden behind layers of institutional authority. This knowledge makes you dangerous to those who profit from deception. What will you do with this forbidden knowledge? Will you retreat into comfortable denial, pretending that what you've learned doesn't matter? Will you accept the lies because fighting them seems too difficult, too dangerous, too isolating? Or will you join the growing community of truth seekers who refuse to accept convenient fictions, who demand authentic knowledge regardless of the personal cost? The journey that began with a simple question about calendar discrepancies has revealed a truth so profound, so threatening to established power structures, that most people will refuse to accept it. But you are no longer most people. You have seen behind the veil of official reality, and you can never unsee what you've discovered. You now understand that the phantom time hypothesis is just the beginning, the tip of an iceberg of deception that extends far beyond medieval history. The same techniques used to fabricate the Carolingian period have been employed throughout history to create whatever past serves the needs of those in power. The same institutions that conspired to steal 3 centuries continue to shape our understanding of reality through the careful manipulation of information. But knowledge brings both burden and opportunity. You are no longer a passive consumer of official truth, no longer dependent on institutional authorities to tell you what to believe. You have developed the critical thinking skills necessary to evaluate evidence independently, to question assumptions that most people never examine, to see patterns that remain invisible to those who trust in conventional wisdom. This is your invitation to join a growing community of independent researchers, critical thinkers, and truth seekers who refuse to accept easy answers to complex questions. Around the world, people are awakening to the reality that official narratives often serve political purposes rather than historical accuracy. They're learning to think for themselves, to evaluate evidence critically, to ask the uncomfortable questions that institutions prefer to avoid. The path forward requires courage, intellectual honesty, and a willingness to challenge your own preconceptions. It means learning to distinguish between genuine evidence and manufactured proof, between authentic research and institutional propaganda. It means developing the skills necessary to evaluate competing claims independently without relying on appeals to authority or consensus. Start with the phantom time hypothesis itself. Don't take our word for what the evidence shows. Examine it yourself. Read Heribert Illig's original research study, The Astronomical Calculations Analyze the Archaeological Evidence. Look at the methodological problems with carbon dating and dendrochronology that mainstream scientists prefer to ignore. Most importantly, think for yourself about what the evidence actually proves. But don't stop with medieval history. Apply the same critical thinking skills to other historical narratives that seem too convenient, too politically useful, too perfectly aligned with contemporary power structures. Question the official stories about ancient civilizations, classical antiquity, recent conflicts. Ask yourself who benefits from particular interpretations of the past, who has the power to shape historical narratives, who profits from public acceptance of official truth. The internet has made independent research easier than ever before. Primary sources that were once available only to academic specialists can now be accessed by anyone with curiosity and determination. Alternative perspectives that were once suppressed by institutional gatekeepers can now reach global audiences. The monopoly on information that once protected historical deceptions is breaking down. But be careful. The same tools that enable independent research also facilitate the spread of deliberate misinformation. Not every alternative narrative is accurate. Not every challenge to official truth is legitimate. The goal isn't to replace one set of dogmas with another, but to develop the intellectual tools necessary to evaluate competing claims on their own merits. Learn to recognize the hallmarks of genuine research. Careful attention to evidence, acknowledgement of uncertainty, willingness to revise conclusions when new data emerges, transparency about methodology and sources. Distinguish this from propaganda, masquerading as scholarship selective use of evidence. Overconfident claims about complex issues, refusal to engage with contrary evidence. Appeals to emotion rather than reason. The phantom time investigation teaches us that truth is often uncomfortable. The genuine discovery requires questioning the most fundamental assumptions about reality. The researchers who first challenged the conventional medieval timeline faced ridicule, professional ostracism, and deliberate suppression of their work. But they persisted because they understood that intellectual integrity matters more than social acceptance. You are now part of this tradition of independent inquiry, this community of people who value truth more than comfort. But with this membership comes responsibility. It's not enough to passively consume alternative information. You must become an active participant in the search for authentic knowledge. Share what you've learned with others who might be ready to hear it. Engage in respectful dialogue with people who hold different views, always focusing on evidence rather than personalities. Support researchers and institutions that demonstrate genuine commitment to truth-seeking, regardless of whether their conclusions support your existing beliefs. Most importantly, never stop questioning. The moment you become too comfortable with any particular narrative, the moment you stop examining evidence critically, you risk falling into the same trap that has ensnared countless generations before us. Truth is not a destination, but a journey. Not a fixed dogma, but an ongoing process of discovery and revision. The phantom time hypothesis has shown you that even the most basic assumptions about historical chronology may be false. What other foundational beliefs about reality might be equally questionable? What other institutions that claim authority might be engaged in systematic deception? What other facts that everyone accepts might actually be carefully constructed fiction? These are the questions that will guide your continued investigation and the intellectual challenges that will drive your personal quest for authentic knowledge. You have taken the first step on a journey that has no final destination, but every step brings you closer to genuine understanding of the world around you. The truth is out there, scattered across thousands of documents, hidden in archaeological sites, encoded in astronomical observations, preserved in the testimony of independent researchers who chose integrity over institutional approval. But it's up to you to find it, to piece together the fragments of authentic history from the debris of official lies. Keep questioning, keep searching, keep thinking for yourself. The answers may be closer than you think, but they will only be found by those brave enough to look beyond the comfortable certainties that most people mistake for truth. You are no longer alone in this search. Around the world, other awakened minds are asking the same questions, challenging the same assumptions, refusing to accept the same comfortable lies. Together, you form a global community of truth seekers, united not by shared dogmas, but by shared commitment to intellectual honesty and genuine discovery. The phantom time conspiracy may have succeeded for 1,000 years, but its days are numbered. Truth has a way of emerging despite the best efforts of those who would suppress it. And you are now part of the force that will finally bring this ancient deception into the light. Welcome to the community of truth seekers. Welcome to the journey toward authentic knowledge. Welcome to the most important investigation of your life. The phantom centuries are just the beginning. What will you discover next?